that we're going to talk about, which is the willing to negotiate. Remember, there's 4 major primary service factors. Location, we talked about the relevance of location. We started with name, the importance of name, but that's not a service factor. But then location, and then the financial drivers, and then the willingness to negotiate and transportation. So let's talk about the willing to negotiate. Now, this is a touchy subject, and it's very easy to get defensive and to only look at it from the chiropractor's perspective or from the treating doctor's perspective. So let's try to step back and understand a little bit more of the total perspective, and then what we can do to make this work. Okay, so let's look at the attorney's perspective first. So when you look at the attorney's perspective, you have to remember that they have an expectancy in the industry. They have an industry norm of a third, a third, a third. A third goes to medical bills, a third goes into their pocket, and a third goes into the patient's. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of an industry standard. So if that's their industry standard, then it's important to understand and respect that, and not just attack it or not pay attention to it. So we do want to pay attention to the industry standard. Number 2, they do have a primary duty to maximize compensation for their clients, as well as obviously it benefits them the more they help their clients. And remember, a claim essentially becomes a civil suit, and a civil suit is about assets, transfer of assets. So that is the primary perspective from the attorney's perspective. Now, let's look at the chiropractor's perspective. A lot of times the chiropractors will, these are the 3 common factors that the chiropractors will say. Number 1 is I put the time and effort in. In other words, it was real time to the chiropractor. And I don't want to diminish anything you're saying. All I just want to do is put it in perspective. That's all. And is it real? Yes. Could it matter? Absolutely not. It depends on the target market. So you could be totally right in what you're saying, but totally wrong relative to the relationship with a personal injury attorney. And remember, it's the target market's perspective that always matters if you want or expect business from that particular target market. If you don't want or expect business from that target market, then you can certainly stay irrelevant in your mindset. So the chiropractor's perspective, number 1, is they actually physically put the time in. And a lot of times they say, well, the attorney really didn't put the time in per se. Okay, so that's true. You do put the time in when you treat the patient. You have given up X amount of time to treat that patient. That's a fact, okay? Now, second thing I often hear is the time could have been used for other money-generating purposes. Instead of cutting your bill, it could have been used for other money-generating services, and that's definitely a fact. So we're not disputing a fact, we're just trying to put things in perspective relative to a target market. And then the third argument that I often hear is the attorney would not even have a case without what you did. Well, that's true, except a thing called competition. Now, if you had a monopoly, that would be 100% true with that type of mindset. But there's this thing called competition, as you know, and the less you're willing to do, somebody else is willing to step up to the plate to get that business. So the competition, in a sense, holds us to certain standards. So these are all those statements that I hear are real true. There's no denying any of those. But how do they relate to referrals from personal injury attorneys in the case? So what is the real problem when you're looking at when attorneys ask you to reduce your bill, or will you negotiate your fee, etc.? Well, here's the real problem: is the medical expenses, or your bill, is out of line with the ratio. That's the bottom line. If your medical bills were not out of line with the ratio of the claim, what the claim could bring monetarily to the personal injury attorney, there wouldn't be a problem. Now, they're always going to ask for a reduction in fee, but there's a difference, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, between greed and unsatisfaction. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. So the absolute problem is the out-of-kilter bill. Now, there could be several reasons for this. Number one is excessive services relative to what the claim's going to bring. And let me just say up front that the services are not. You can justify any service, and I'm often the doctors will justify what they're doing, and you can justify any service. You can justify $10,000 in services, $20,000, $50,000, because let's face it, are there physical medicine? If we're looking at the three phases of healing, the inflammation, repair, and model phase, aren't there multiple types of physical medicine that you could apply physiologically, clinically, that would result in a large bill? In addition, how about nutritional supports? How about medication support? How about psychological support? Other professions such as acupuncture, massage, naturopathy. In other words, aren't there an unbelievable amount of therapeutics and a multitude of different professions that will have some type of therapy, biofeedback, yoga, that will attempt to affect pain or inflammation in the inflammatory phase? Yes. So could I justify clinically a huge multitude of therapies? Yes, I can justify that. Could I justify them in the repair phase? Certainly, I could do that too. And I could do that in the remodel phase. So physiologically, I can justify a tremendous amount of therapeutics in one heck of a large bill. But totally clinically justifiable. I can physiologically explain all those. That's not the point, though. The bottom line is, what's the relationship? Now we're talking about personal injury attorney referrals. We're not talking about a clinical symposium. So we need to get our mindsets out of the clinical aspect and into the marketing aspect of a personal injury attorney. And those are two different mindsets. And so we're just trying to come over and cross the border here and go into a little bit more of a mindset from a marketing standpoint, not the clinician standpoint. And sometimes it's hard for doctors to do that. So what's the relationship of the medical bills, the treatments, the diagnostics, relative to the value of the claim? That's the bottom line. And is there a clinical justification? Well, as we said, you can easily justify. Now, I wanted to ask you, if you did all these services, let's say your bill was $30,000 in your chiropractic expenses, would it matter if the settlement was for $150,000? No, it wouldn't. You see, so it's back to the clinical aspect from the personal injury attorney marketing isn't what's relative. What's relative is the ratio of the case value. And that's where it needs to be reined in and looked at from that perspective. So and again, that's if you want referrals from attorneys. So again, if your services resulted in larger claim values that were greater than the medical bills, a third ratio, would the attorney still ask you for a discount? Probably. Yeah, that's his duty. But would he be satisfied with the claim that he did get because it was above and beyond 1/3 of the medical bills in excess of the claim, versus the medical bills were way in excess of 1/3 of what the claim value brought? See, that is the perspective. So would the personal injury attorney be upset? Well, let's go into the difference between being unsatisfied versus greed. Okay, so let's say that the personal injury, your bill was large, but this financial settlement was easily greater than 1/3 of the medical expenses. Say the total medical expenses maybe were $20,000, but the claim settled for $100,000. So is the personal injury attorney still going to ask you for a fee reduction? Yes, you can expect it, because that's his duty. That's his due diligence, is to try to decrease all the other expenditures of the case to maximize the value for the client, and therefore self-motive himself. That's the fact. That's just the way it is. But there's a difference between unsatisfied versus greed. See, in the first case, there's greed involved. In other words, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm saying that he's not going to be angry with you if you don't cut your bill. In other words, let's say your bill was $20,000 and a large part of what you did or all of it helped receive a claim for him for $100,000. So it was in excess of the third significantly. Would he still probably ask you for a reduction? Yes. Would he be unsatisfied with you if you did not reduce your bill? No. So he's going to ask from a greed perspective. But now let's reverse the shoe here, and let's say and this is the common scenario that I see routinely, is let's say your bill is $7,000, and let's say that case value went for $12,000. So your bill was not from a clinical standpoint. Remember, clinically you can justify almost any amount of money. That is not the perspective I'm talking about. I'm talking about from a marketing relationship perspective relative to real money. Real money. That's what we're talking about, not the clinical perspective. So if your bill was $7,000 and he was only to get $12,000 out of the case, well, that leaves a problem. That creates a big problem. Will he be unsatisfied? Well, we'll go into that here. So the focus and part of the problem is the chiropractors. Let's give an example as a chiropractor bill relative to no other medicals. Let's just look at it in relationship that all the medicals are from the chiropractic bill to simplify this. Well, here's three perspectives that are creating problems. Number one, the chiropractors can see a billing opportunity. And that's kind of what happened here in Florida is no fault state. There was $10,000 in PIP, and there was a race in therapy and services to get that $10,000. Some people were more aggressive than others. And the stats came back that for the same diagnosis, for low back pain, neck pain, etc., that the cost when the patient had PIP coverage was tenfold a patient who did not have PIP coverage who had the same diagnosis. And that's a main reason why they were easily to go in and change the PIP law and modify it, is because they were showing the total incongruency and the outlandish billing for the same diagnosis for a non-PIP carrier. And again, you can justify clinically either way, but that's not the perspective. We're talking about the personal injury attorney relationship, not the clinical perspective. So one issue is there's a certain amount of money on the table that you see as available to do services. And we all know that that exists to some degree, whether it exists with you or not, or to the degree or your friends or relatives or friends that you know, etc. The second problem is the chiropractors don't pay attention to the settlement rates relative to their bill. I routinely see chiropractors just run up the bill with kind of a low-end case, and they're not paying attention to what the true value of this case is going to bring. And so their ratio is far disproportionate to the value of the case. Well, they themselves have created the problem. You've put this way out of kilter. And so not paying attention to the value of the case and then just keep putting your time and energy in, and you can justify everything you're doing from a clinical perspective. You can justify every therapy, all the treatments, etc., etc., etc. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a relationship with personal injury attorneys and referrals. We're not talking about the clinical side. So I see that frequently is the chiropractors don't pay attention to, as the case is going on, the expectancy of what this case is going to bring. That's a big mistake. The case should always be communicated with the attorney in what you believe you can prove objectively relative to what these types of objective findings will bring for your locality and that claim for your area. And that should be in common communication with the attorney, so you don't waste a lot of your time and energy on these cases and then put everything in a bad situation, so to speak. The third problem is the chiropractors not being up to par with the discovery and documentation of the financial drivers to support a higher value case. And that's very common. Most chiropractors don't document into all the, especially all the major financial drivers with the major injuries, as well as some of the secondary financial drivers. But most of the time, it's rarely that I see a chiropractor who has maximized all the financial drivers, the primary financial drivers, not even including the secondary financial drivers, which are they're important, but not as important as the primary. So those are the three main issues that I'm seeing. So let's take this case again. So the chiropractic bill is $7,000. Let's say the case settlement was for $10,000. And by the way, this is kind of a common connective tissue type of case. The chiropractic bill was $7,000, and let's say there's no other medicals. The case settlement was for $12,000. So you subtract your 12 from 7, and here is your problem. There's a remainder of $5,000. And so the personal injury attorney gets 2.5, the patient gets 2.5. And there's other factors, obviously, as there are secondary insurance and LOPs and all these other factors, but that's not the point I'm getting at here. The point I'm getting at is destroying the ratio, and then for whatever reason, but destroying that ratio, and that alone creates the problem. It forces the attorney to ask for a fee reduction. It forces, and then when there's not, then there's a tremendous amount of the relationship just won't exist. You'll just kill the relationship when these factors are not present. So how can you expect to get referrals from personal injury attorneys if you're destroying the standard, if you're destroying the expectation of the industry standard? And that's the question. And I don't know of any chiropractors that routinely destroy ratios that regularly get referrals from personal injury attorneys. Now, I do know plenty of chiropractors who charge large fees and justify all the clinical expenditures, but what they can produce as far as the case value is not proportional to their services, and so they've set themselves up for the problem. They've created this problem. And again, I'm not saying that your services aren't worth it and they couldn't have done it without you and all that. All of that is true. That is not the point. The point is you're dealing with somebody else. If you want business from a personal injury attorney or anybody, a patient, a personal, you have to consider their perspectives, and that's all we're trying to do is share some of these perspectives and some ways to get around it or to work within these boundaries. And one of the problems is that I see is chiropractors that don't have very big practices. They see low volume of new patients, very limited new patients, and so when they get a personal injury case, it's a chance for some large billings. And again, they're all physiologically justified, but now they've positioned themselves, and because they have low productivity, they've positioned themselves by increasing the fees and services on this particular case, and that throws that whole case into a tailspin with the ratio that doesn't work, which forces the attorney to ask for the reduction. He's going to anyway, but here's the problem. If he's not getting a higher claim value than the ratio, he'll still ask, but it's greed-based. He won't be dissatisfied. If the ratio's lower and you can't put your bill in line with the ratio, now he's unsatisfied. And you're not going to get referrals from an unsatisfied patient or an unsatisfied attorney. So here's an example. I was talking to a client the other day, and we were discussing this a little bit, primary, secondary factors, etc. And he had received a phone call from a large law firm in the area that they were firing their other chiropractors that they would routinely refer to. It was a multi-clinic facility in a large town, and he has multiple offices. So they essentially were firing the other chiropractors in all those offices and not going to be referring business because they weren't working with within the industry stand lines and the ratios. So they're about to, they lose all the referral business. And that's the first question they asked him. So the need was there, fortunately, with these attorneys. But what made them go in a different direction was the dissatisfaction with the willing to negotiate. And so they fired that group of chiropractors. And then they, first question out of their mouth with this chiropractor, they told them right up front, here's the problem, here's who we refer to typically. They're not willing to negotiate with us and keep these ratios in line. Are you willing to? And if you are, we're willing to talk to you. If you're not, we're not. And that's the bottom line. So you can throw out all the clinical aspects and kind of look at the interrelationship with the attorney. So you got a couple options. You can stay dogmatic and justify everything you do clinically, have a large bill, large case value that's totally disproportionate to the claim, and that's going to set up unsatisfaction with the personal injury attorney, and you could pretty much expect not to get any referrals from that attorney, but you can feel good about what you're doing. Again, you can justify it. You can stay in your clinical mentality and justify what you're doing. But all that leads to no referrals, leads to no business. So here's the suggestion, is be willing to negotiate. Remember, willingness to negotiate is a primary service factor. Remember, there were four primary service factors. It was the location, financial drivers, willing to negotiate, and transportation. That is a reason enough to not do business with you, even when there is an established need. Okay? So willing to negotiate is very important. So here's my suggestions relative to negotiate. Number one, keep your services or fees in relationship to the value of the case amount. In other words, you got to do a couple things here. Number one is you got to know case values for those types of injuries. What do they typically draw with what you can document? What do they typically draw? And pay attention to your case value. I have clients that have $1 million personal injury offices, and they pay attention to these ratios because they know the importance of the attorney getting paid and not being mad, and helping everybody out as much as possible. Number two is continual communication with the attorney with your case expectations. And this is a problem I'm seeing a lot of my clients, they don't keep in touch with, now the clients I have that are higher end attorneys, they have multiple personal injury offices and things like that. They routinely keep in touch with their personal injury attorneys, keeping them abreast of the case and what they can objectify. What can they document and objectify, and therefore help with the attorney's claim? They're constantly in contact. So a common problem is the chiropractor just start running with the case, never contact the attorney, and here goes the bill, and never speak with the attorney about what the likelihood of that case value is. And let's face it, it's short-term thinking. That's the bottom line. The difference is making a lot more money now for one case and not getting any referrals versus restrain and working within the parameters of a working relationship and communication. So the third factor is modifying your fees relative to frequency treatments, either your dollar per visit fees or your frequency treatments, accordingly to make sure everybody wins. The patient gets as much care as they need. The case value is maximized optimally, and there's not unsatisfaction relative to the amount of the claim that's awarded relative to the medical expenses. So number two, so that was number one, keep your fees in relationship to what the expectation of the case value is. Number two is to learn to discover and document the financial drivers that support higher claims. So then if you're a client, that's what you're doing, is we're helping you discover and document these financial drivers, which will help drive, well, not drive the claims up, but get the maximum value for the claim. And of course, if you do that, especially relative to the competition, and that ratio is greater than your fees, you've exceeded the ratio. Because remember, it's the ratio. It's your case value, your case average relative to the claim settlement. So if you can document and objectify these injuries to help maximize the claim settlement, it helps take that case into a positive ratio of medical expenses and out of the attorney being mad at you or unjustified, and then when they ask for a fee reduction, now there's much more pressure on you not to do it for the previous reasons stated that you did expend your time and energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, they couldn't have done the case without you. Well, yeah, they can. They will find somebody to do the case without you, unless you're that much better than your competition. And that's what is recommended, is being significantly better than your competition relative to the documentation of these financial drivers. And number 3 is educating the attorney. It's very important, educating the attorney, so they don't rush to processing these cases. And I put a lot of emphasis on that. The attorneys I worked with, that was the first thing that I did when I got referrals, is immediately went and met with the attorneys to start educating them. And there's 3 components of education. Number 1 is I talked to them about the 3 phases of healing relative to the therapy. That's important. I've talked to them about the discovery and documentation process relative to the major injuries, and that helps with their claim, so they understand what's involved and the time frames needed, etc., because of the healing phases. There's some things that just aren't going to be as clinically reliable after 1 or 2 months of care versus 4, 6, or 9 months of care, and they need to understand that. And that's part of the educating the attorney, to stop them from just trying to rip cases out from under you in 6 to 8 weeks and process them, which almost will guarantee a low case value, which now helps to put your bill in a distorted perception of the ratio value of the claim. And then, of course, now they want a fee reduction to make the ratio work. You don't want to, because you put the time in and you're worth it, and now you got a problem. Here's the real problem. You don't get business from that attorney. That's the bottom line real problem. So number 3 is how your discovery and documentation will support higher claims. So part of the education process is sharing with them what you're doing with the discovery documentation to help with the financial drivers and to maximize the value of the claim. So that's what, from an educational standpoint, okay? So let's see here. Suggest PI attorneys, referrals, pay attention. So what we need to do is be highly aware of the target market's needs, wants and needs. And here's the 3 components, is do a better job with the documenting and supporting the financial drivers, number 1. Number 2, pay attention to the injury standards. With those types of injuries, what are the expected claim values for your area? There are standards with these normal routine injuries. So be in communication with your attorney to understand those values, so you don't waste a lot of time and energy relative to the patient in services that you're probably not going to get reimbursed for, or if you demand to get reimbursed for them, you're going to kill the relationship. So either keep your bill from getting out of balance or be willing to reduce as necessary. So we got some real problems here, because it's easy to justify what you're doing physiologically, and but if it throws the case out of value, you're creating a problem. And that, remember, if you're wanting referrals from that attorney, you have to be respectful of their wants and needs, of your primary target's wants and needs. So in my particular case, I never had to, I was never asked to reduce a fee from my attorneys, my circle of influence attorneys. And the reason that I wasn't is 2 reasons. Number 1 is I educated them into the phases of healing and the time frames, and I stayed in touch with the attorney on what I had. By the way, I never lost a case in court either, but I also told the attorney not to go to court, that I wouldn't be able to support him with some of the cases that I worked with total objective documentation. So e- educating the patient the attorney is very important. Also, I never had high dollar per visits. My dollar per visit average was 38. So $38 per visit. I didn't have $150 per visit and $250 per visits. So my average case typically was not over $3,000. So my ratios were very congruent relative to the claim values, and they typically exceeded the claim values of a third, my fees. And a lot of times I was the only provider with those guys because it was a typical soft tissue injury. They didn't really need any other type of care per se. And but so my bill was totally in line with the claim value, and they received a third, a third, a third, or greater relative to my bill. And that's why I got referrals. Um, so if you take those ratios, let's say the standard connective tissue case is 12,000, subtract out my bill for 3,000, you got $9,000 left over. So you can see they get in excess more than a third than my medical bills. Now, will they still ask on occasion? Yeah, your circle of influence attorneys shouldn't and generally won't. But they're feeling pretty good right now when what they get, the claims they get, and the medical bills are lower than those ratios. They feel that warm and fuzzy in working with you, and especially if you have the ability to give very good objective documentation to maximize these financial drivers instead of these rush low-end cases. And that is how I kept the referrals coming. I didn't think of it from a one case perspective. So the key is to pay attention to the case ratio and don't waste your time and money thinking, that there's this bucket of gold at the end and to doing the services, etc., the frequency and the services to get to the pot of gold when rushing in that fashion is going to create a problem. It's going to create a problem with your referring attorney. So those are some factors. They're very sensitive factors. There's a lot of justification, as I said earlier, about your services and what you can justify. But that's not what we're talking about. This is not a clinical issue. This is a business issue, and it's about getting referrals from attorneys and making it work for them. And here's the bottom line. You don't make it work for them, they're going to fire you, just like my friends who got the call, my client who got the call, and that large attorney firm fired that group. And what do you think the chances are of them coming back and saying, oh, no, 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 we didn't mean that. We'll go ahead and work with you. Okay? So pay attention to the ratios, and the best thing really to do is do good documentation, maximize the financial drivers, keep in touch with the attorney throughout the case so your frequency and treatments are not excessively exceeding what the true value of this case is going to be, and then go to the next case. Don't try to get rich on one case. Go to the next case. Okay? So that's the suggestion for the referrals.